This next step is to clean the remaining variables. So you should have at least 2 variables of interest. Some of you might have more than that. But for example, I have this generalized anxiety disorder scale. So I created a total score from Qualtrics, but it looks like it didn't quite work properly. So you'll always want to double check and make sure that it worked. So look for blank spaces. So notice that this one right here, it has a dot. That means that this is missing. And so my my score calculation in Qualtrics, sometimes it doesn't always work. It's supposed to, but because it didn't, we need to fix it. So here's a couple ways you can do it. If you don't have a lot of responses, you can just look through. And if you don't see, if you notice that this row, for example, is missing a response, you can just delete that total, because we don't want to create a total score if they didn't respond to all the questions. So that's one option. And I'm just going to look through this. So you can see it's pretty easy to tell which have responses and which don't. These are all blank, and it didn't create a response there. So it worked somewhat. It just didn't fully work, which can happen. So again, you can take a look through and see if you're missing anything. I have a lot more responses than this one, so it takes a little bit longer to go through. It's also more prone to human error. The other way you can do this is that you can recalculate this total. So there's a separate video on sum, but I'm just going to show this really quickly. So this is for any quantitative variable. If you have a quantitative variable that you calculated or that you need to calculate, this is the process you can go through. So you go to transform, compute variable, and then this shows the labels for the variables. So I'm going to right click, display variable names, and I'm going to create a new variable. And I'm actually going to overwrite my GAD total. So my GAD total is the variable that Qualtrics created, but I'm going to fix it. And what I need to do is to make sure that it doesn't add in missing responses, I just double click and press enter. And then the next one, double click and press enter, double click and press enter, double click and press enter. So those of you that have reverse scored questions, you'd have to actually reverse score them first. So it's more work to have to do this. If you have reverse scoring, there's a separate video on that. And you should just ask your TA or me if I'm there, and we can come help you with this process. But I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, change existing variable. And then you'll notice that it calculated the total for each of them, and it left this blank, which is what we wanted. So that is what you need to do for any quantitative measures. So those of you that have a between subjects design, you might need to create a new variable for your independent variable. So if you had conditions that people were assigned to, then you need to create a variable for that. If you did it within subjects design, you don't need to do that, because you should already have 2 scores, one for before or from condition 1 and one from condition 2. So this is only for people that have an experimental design that's between subjects. So here, I'm going to call this my independent variable. I'm just going to say IV for generic. And I'm going to add a label here that this is my IV. And then what you want to do is go to values, and you would say, okay, my value is 1 is going to be my control condition, or whatever you want to call it. So let's say that it was cold room or warm room, or hard condition, easy condition, whatever it might be. And I'm going to make 2 my experimental condition. I'm going to add and say okay. So if we look back at our variables that show the conditions, I'm going to double click on this. What happened is that Qualtrics created a randomization order. And this is the step that you had to complete where you did the exact order. You had to record the randomization order from Qualtrics. So what you need to do is you need to identify what condition they were in and then assign it in this new variable. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. if you don't want to have to worry about going through and using formulas in the transformation process, you can totally just sort, that's fine. None of you have so much data that this should be problematic, but you can go to this variable and you can see mine, it came up with this name of FL_9 and then IV control. So this is the control condition for this group. Yours is going to depend on what you named it in Qualtrics. So you might need to look at Qualtrics, but you can see that there's a 1 here and this is blank. This means that this person was assigned to the control condition. So I'm going to right click, and if I sort ascending, it puts all of the missing at the bottom. And if I sort descending, it puts all of them in this condition here. So I could theoretically just go ahead and say, oh, hey, there's this control here. I'm just going to go ahead and say control here. Because it's a 1 here, that means that they're in the control condition. That's the variable here. And then if there's a 1 in this one, that means they're experimental. So that is one option. And you can click out of it, right click on that, copy it, and then you can highlight, oops, so that's why this is not the best option, but you highlight, you right click, and then you can paste. And so then you do all of those at the same time. And then you would do the same thing for this. And you can right click, sort descending on this one and say, oh, this is experimental. And then right click, copy, highlight down to there and paste. So it's relatively safe from user error as long as you're paying attention. So I have deleted the responses that I added here. This is the other way you can do this. You go to transform, and then you're going to recode into different variables. And I'm going to right click here, display variable names. So I'm going to see what variables I'm working with here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this is my old variable. This is my input variable. So this is one of those levels. This says control on it. So we know this is the control. And we want to put this into our IV. So this is going to match the one that's already here. This is going to go into the new variable. I go to old and new values. And if it's a 1, what that means is that it's listed as a 1 in our old variable that Qualtrics gave us. And I actually want it to stay a 1 in my new variable because that's the control condition. So I'm going to say continue. And then I need to click change here. I'm going to say it's going to duplicate an existing variable name. That's fine. I know I created this new variable here, so that's fine. Say okay. And then when I click OK, what happens is that it fills this in for me. There's a separate video that's longer for this that talks about recoding if you wanted to see that. So actually, here it is that it shows it, right? So if it was 1 here, and click my values button, it's a 1 here. So that's what I just did. Now, if it's a 1 here, I don't want it to be a 1 again, because then all of my numbers under IV are going to be 1. If it's a 1 in this column, I want it to be a 2 because that's experimental. So I'm going to go back to transform, recode into different variables, and then I'm going to change this. So I am going to click my back arrow. I could also reset. I'm going to move my experimental condition over here. I'm going to still put that into the independent variable. So same variable, I'm going to change that, say okay. And I need to change my old and new values. So now if it was a 1 in my old variable, I want it to become a 2. So I'm going to change that to 2 and click change. So you want to make sure, oh no, and pay attention to what you're doing. So this should be a 2, not a 21, and I'm going to click change. So my 1 is going to become a 2, continue, and okay. So now you can see that if it was in the experimental column right here, there was a 1, then it became experimental here. And if it was a 1 in this column, it became control over here. That's how you transform your independent variables. And then there's a few last possibilities. Some of you are collecting a score that you'll have to turn into categories. So let's say that you needed to create a new score or a new variable where you call it like anxiety levels. So I'm going to go to my variable view. I'm going to say anxiety levels, no spaces in your names, anxiety levels. I'm going to make this have values where 1 equals low stress, 2 equals moderate stress, and 3 equals high stress. So those of you that are using a total score to create a category. So I think there's a couple of groups that are using like attachment styles, and you'll get a score. And if they get between a certain number, then they're in a different attachment style. Then you would do this. You would create a new variable with your levels and say, okay. And then you're actually going to make this nominal because it's categorical, right? We're going to do the same process, a very similar process to what we did before. So if we look at our data view, we can see that our responses range from the lower numbers up to in the 20s from what we can see here. So let's say that I'm going to transform, recode into different variables. I'm going to move this back. I can take my GAD total as my old variable, can put this into my new anxiety levels, old and new values, and I can say, I'm going to clear this out, remove. I can say that if the range is from 0 to 9, I'm going to call that my low, which was 1, low anxiety. So all values of 0 through 9 are going to become this first category. And then if it's 10 through 19, I'm going to call that the moderate, which was 2. So I'll say add. And then if it was 20, and I can actually put, I could put the range there, but I could say range value through highest. So I could say 20 and higher. So range value, so 20 through the highest value is going to be 3, add. And so what happens is that if I say okay, it creates these new categories here. I'm going to grab this and move it over so it's right next to it. But you can see that 11 is moderate, 20 is high, 15 is moderate based on those categories I created. So this is a little bit trickier. Feel free to have your TA or me, if I'm there, come over and help you with this. But that's how you're going to manage your variables. So there are additional videos in the guide if you need them, and then make sure to ask your TA if you have questions.